Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here, welcome back to the railway and welcome to another review. Today I'm looking at the largest ever tank engine from Hornby. Today's loco is very unusual. It is absolutely huge and it looks completely unlike any other tank engine. It is of course this, the Hornby Great Western 72XX locomotive. And although the prototype for this model was quite remarkable, it is this model itself that sticks in my mind, and it does that because I remember this is one of the first locos I was ever disappointed in. Yeah, back in 2017 when I first reviewed this, I did not like it. I thought it was no good. And this was really one of the first locos to make me think critically about models and their manufacturers, rather than just being unconditionally positive about everything, which was how a lot of reviews at the time were conducted, and still are today if you look in the right places. But no, this loco started to make me think, is this really value for money? Is this actually any good? Am I really happy with this locomotive? And I think the reason I was not too happy with this one was because it was a design clever locomotive. Now, design clever was a Hornby regime from about 10 to 15 years ago, and I could probably make an entire video about that subject all by itself. But to sum it up, basically, the regime involved Hornby making cheaper locos, cutting corners to make them cheaper, some would say nastier, I would say nastier, and then still selling them at a high price. That's probably not how Hornby would choose to describe design clever, but that's certainly how I perceived it at the time. This loco, for instance, was incredibly expensive. I paid a heavily reduced price for this, £85, because presumably it didn't sell very well, but according to my notes from 2017, the RRP for this was around £150. A lot of money back then, and if I adjust that price for inflation and then add a tenner, which seems to be how Hornby calculate their prices these days, I can give you an idea of what this might cost if it came back into the range today. And that figure is £197. So this would be approximately a £200 loco at RRP, and I'll leave it up to you to decide whether or not you think this would be worth that kind of money. And the funny thing is, when Hornby talk about design clever, I heard Simon talk about this in a podcast or one of their YouTube videos or something. He said people didn't like the lack of detail, it didn't work, we had to stop doing it. And I don't know if I entirely agree with that, because I think there is a real market for less detailed locos. I think people would be only too happy to buy them, provided the savings in manufacturing were represented in the price. I think if the manufacturer pockets those savings and then still sells the models expensively, that's when customers are not going to be too happy. And sure enough, I think that's what Hornby did. These models, at least in my eyes, were still sold really expensively. The detail wasn't there. Of course, people weren't too happy about that, and the regime failed, and hey ho, they don't do it anymore. But anyway, that's enough about design clever. Let's have a look at the loco. Let's see if it's as bad as I remember. I think it probably will be. And we'll hopefully have some fun with this thing. So let's get started. Here we go. Alright, the Hornby 72XX or 7200 class. Really curious to take another look at this loco, because I think back to it and I think, oh, that loco wasn't very good. But it's been so long since I last looked at this, I don't exactly remember the reasons, so I'm curious to rediscover that. I do remember there was a big glue mark on one side of the body which really stood out, and I guess in many ways it was that glue mark that really got me thinking about the loco. Is this really a decent model? Well, we'll see in just a second. Let me show you the end of the box then. So the product code for this is R3464. It is in the BR livery, Lake Crest, class 72XX, and the number is 7224. And if I flip the box over, show you the back of it, you can see that this was classified as an 8F. This is a tank engine, folks, classified as an 8F, very, very beefy machine. And then in the middle, you can see we've got a brief history on the class, so pause and read that if you'd like. And then on the far end of the box, you've got some of Hornby's drawings here. These are dated from 2011, so this model is just over 10 years old now, assuming the model came out a year or two after the drawings. So, very interesting stuff. Let's pull this model out and see what this is like. Right, you ready for the reveal? Here we go. And it's an interesting loco as well. Pity that it wasn't done ever so well, because like I say, it's quite unique in being the largest ever Great Western tank engine. Anyway, let's pull it out. Let's have a look. Have we got instructions? Yep, we've got some instructions in here. So, this is for the 42, 52 and 72XX class. Of course, different locos, completely different wheel configurations, but I believe they were tooled at pretty much the same time and they have very similar chassis. So there you go, you can see a bit of the chassis on there actually. Lubrication shows you the crank pins and the axles, the standard stuff. Body removal, a couple of screws, one at the front, one at the back, and that of course gives you access to the DCC decoder socket, which is an 8-pin one. And then you've also got a little bit about fitting brake rods and accessories. And as you can tell, very few accessories. In fact, it just appears to be brake rods and vacuum pipes. And then anything of interest on the back? Nope, not really. All right, so let's see what we actually do get in the pack. And let's see what accessories we actually get as well. So there is a bag on top here, so let's have a look at that. All right, and yeah, sure enough, it's pretty much as sparse as the instructions showed. There are some steps in here. I must have missed that on the drawing. And then, of course, the vacuum pipes and a NEM coupling for the front of the loco, if that's something you want to fit. So very basic, very basic. I would say then, presumably, all of the detail is fitted to the loco, but yeah, it's not that detailed, to be quite honest with you. All right, let's pull this out and have a look. All right, first question. What's the finish like? And the answer is pretty flat. Yeah, not a great finish on this. Fairly typical, don't get me wrong, of Hornby locos from this period. It's not like this would have stood out or anything at the time for having a poor finish, but obviously by today's standards, that's not very good. Anyway, let's pull it out. Ooh, blimey. Yeah, so like I say, this is a gigantic tank engine, one of the biggest ever in Britain, and yet it's pretty lightweight. Yeah, really noticeably light when you pick the thing up. When you consider its size, it's almost amazing that they managed to make it weigh so little. The bodywork is obviously plastic. I mean, it had a plastic finish, but yeah, it feels plastic as well. And the running plate is also made of plastic too. And just think, if they'd have made that out of metal, if that was die cast, how heavy this thing would have been. But no, it's not that heavy. I'll get it on the scales and I'll do a bit of a comparison for you later on, let you know what it weighs. But yeah, it's fairly nondescript, isn't it? I will show you some of the details in just a second and you can make up your own mind what you think this is like. But for now, let's have a little bit of background on the class in real life and how this gigantic tank engine came to be. The Great Western 7200 class was introduced in 1934 to the design of Charles Collett for heavy freight work. They were unusual in that they were the only 282 tank engines ever to be built and used by a British railway, and also the largest tank engines to run on the Great Western. The class was the product of a rebuild of the earlier 4200 and 5205 class, which were originally 280 locomotives. Part of their rebuild involved the extending of their coal bunkers, which necessitated the addition of those trailing wheels to support the extra weight. In total, 54 existing engines were rebuilt into the 7200 design between 1934 and 1939. The class was powerful and relatively successful, although their unprecedented length did get them banned from some goods yards. Withdrawal of the class began in 1962, with the final example surviving in operation until 1965. Today, all but 3 have been scrapped, with the remaining engines under restoration, and I'd love to see one of those run in person one day. So there she is, up close and personal for you, the very unusual 7200 loco from Hornby. And yeah, sure, this is quite a simple model where the level of detail is concerned. But surprisingly, I'm finding myself saying I don't think the level of detail is particularly egregious here. Yeah, there are some visible downgrades, but I don't think they're too bad. Provided those savings were reflected in the cost to the customer, I certainly wouldn't mind seeing new models with this level of detail coming back to the market. I really wouldn't. I think the biggest problem with this thing is the quality. This is not what I would consider to be a high quality model, and I can totally see why the Sam from 6 or 7 years ago was upset when he purchased this thing, because buying expensive locos was a big event for me back then, and to have one turn up that was relatively basic and poor quality, very disappointing. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the weight. It's actually unbelievable, as I say, how light they managed to make this. It comes in at 236 grams, thanks to its largely plastic body construction. Now, to give you a sense of how light this is compared with other locos in the collection, I thought we would play a little game. So I'm going to show you some other locos, and you've got to guess whether they are heavier than the 72XX or lighter than the 72XX. And I'm going to keep the camera in this fixed position so you can get a sense of their size in comparison. Here's a clue. It's quite an easy game. Are you ready? Here we go. First of all, we have the Kerr Stuart Victory from Planet Industrials. Lovely loco, very, very small compared to the 72XX. What do you reckon, heavier or lighter? Well, it is heavier than the 7200 by 5 grams. Let's move on. Here is the Bachmann 08 Shunter. Classic loco, still much smaller than the 72XX. What do you think, heavier or lighter? Well, it is heavier, this time by an even larger margin of 17 grams. Here's another Bachmann loco. This is a pannier tank, the 94XX, gorgeous model. What do you reckon, heavier or lighter? Well, of course it is heavier, this time by an incredible margin of 46 grams. And we've got time for one more contestant. This is a loco that is more similar to the size of the 72XX. It is the Sonic A5 locomotive, similar in size, so are they similar in weight? What do you think, lighter or heavier? Well, obviously it is heavier, this time by almost half again, 102 grams heavier than the 72XX. Okay. Yeah, it's a light loco. It doesn't weigh very much at all, and you notice it as soon as you pull it out of the box. It is quite feeble. And of course there are consequences to the plastic construction. Obviously the finish of the bodywork is quite plasticky looking, and the running plate isn't very straight either. It's not terrible, but if I hold my ruler up towards the front end so that it doesn't get caught on the handrails, you can see, yeah, it's not perfectly straight. It does warp down around the cylinder area. So again, poor quality here. Why is it so plasticky and yet so expensive? I don't know. And because of that plastic construction, there are areas of the model that are incredibly flimsy, such as these steps. Look at that. Now, if that running plate and therefore these steps were die cast, then they would be much sturdier. Instead, I live in fear that I'm going to catch those and break them off. The other noticeable thing is, of course, the glue splodges on the side of the cab. And the funny thing about this is, obviously the factory worker who did this noticed that they'd done it and tried to scrub the glue marks away, because the plastic around the glue marks is kind of polished smooth. And actually the finish on that section is really quite lovely. But yeah, it's almost kind of worse this way, because this means that they noticed that they'd done it. If they hadn't noticed, obviously that would have been very unscrupulous of them, but at least then they could say, oh, we had no idea. No, the fact that this has been scrubbed at and then still been sent out to the customer at the other end is absolutely shocking. And that's not the Chinese workers' fault. You know, they should have been instructed, these are supposed to be high quality models. If you make a mistake on the bodywork, these bodies cost pence to produce, so don't worry about it, throw it away, start again. We're not sending out badly built models to the customers, but obviously that did not happen. Okay, so this is a relatively simple model. Let's have a look at the ways in which this is simple, and in many ways quite clever. Yeah, I've always said there's nothing too clever about the Design Clever locos, but there are some clever design choices here. For instance, this pipework connecting to the safety valves, it's moulded, not separately fitted. Of course, a modern, expensive loco, you'd certainly expect to see this separately fitted, but here it's just moulded, and the relief on that is not too bad. I would not complain too much about that. You've got this little handrail on top of the loco, that's just a plastic piece, so the holders, the handrail itself, all the same part, no wire used just there. Also, the running plate detailing is all part of the moulding, with the exception of some of the grab irons and such. The lamp irons appear to be part of the moulding. One of them's bent over, and I believe that is how it was when I got it, so that's less good. Again, not too careful at the factory, obviously. But yeah, all of this detail part of the running plate. Quite clever, I would say. The buffer beams are relatively simple, nicely painted, as you can see. No screw-link couplings provided, not at all surprised with this loco, but there you have it. And while the buffers are made of metal, one of the few parts on the model that is actually metal, except for the chassis, they're not sprung. Oh, how disappointing. You can imagine how younger Sam felt when he discovered that. Yes, bitter disappointment there. The smoke box is actually fairly nicely done. Now, I couldn't remember whether this had the separately fitted smoke box handle or not. No, it does. It is a separately fitted piece and it's quite fine as well. And then you've also got the lamp bracket fitted, although that is pointing at a funny angle again. You've got the running number and the shed code printed onto there as well, which is good. Obviously, the decoration is very basic here. There is no lining or anything like that. So really, the model should have been quite cheap to produce in terms of decoration. But you have got the British Railways crest on here, which looks absolutely fine. Yeah, very good print from Hornby. And then you've got the running number and the classification E there. Again, that number plate though, we don't have any etched alternatives. I think with an expensive loco, you would kind of expect that these days. In terms of decoration though, that is pretty much it, except for the cylinder drain cocks, which are pre-fitted. That's actually quite a cool feature. Although I'm not too keen on the colour of those. Obviously they've gone for a sort of copper coloured paint, but it looks more pink to me. Maybe that is just me, but that to me is not a convincing copper colour. And the same is true of the whistles. Far from being turned metal whistles, these are literally just painted plastic and they don't look too great. Again, a bit of a pink colour to them. I can't unsee the pink tinge that those have got. Anyway, the handrails are generally quite good. These are mostly made of metal, except for that one I showed you on the top. Yep, these are actual wire handrails, so that's pretty good. The top of the tank's fairly detailed. Most of the detail here, again, is just part of the moulding, but it's nice and crisp, looks absolutely fine. The side of the cab, again, these handrails appear to be wire, which is great. This little sliding panel though, you would think that that would move. Unfortunately it doesn't. That is just again moulded in place, as is the vent on the top of the cab, and the moulding's a little bit softer there as a result. The loco does have a painted cab though. It's a very basic painted cab. The gauges haven't been picked out and such, but I think that's all you need. Again, if this was a cheaper loco, if this was priced reasonably, I wouldn't be complaining about the cab detail. I think it's absolutely all you need. And then around the back, you've got the rear-facing windows with that grille effect on them, although that grille effect is just moulded into the glazing pieces, and then the bars have been painted. So yeah, when you start looking up close, it starts to look a little bit cheap and nasty. Obviously, we've got some locos that have individually fitted bars, which are made of wire or whatever. Yeah, this is a cheaper way of going about it, but again, if it was reflected in the price, that would have been fine. You've got the coal load. Again, I don't think this is a separately fitted one. I'm pretty sure that is fixed in place. I can't get it to move anyway. So yeah, again, that's a real saving on there. And then around the back, you've got a fair bit of separately fitted detail. I think the lamp brackets here are separately fitted. Maybe the steps are not. But then you've got the same simple buffer beam without any of the sprung buffers, which is unfortunate. And then the very droopy coupling. Yeah, that is the way this one is, unfortunately. Visibly drooping, and it causes all the problems you'd expect it to, given the angle of it. Anyway, the coupling, connecting rods and the wheels themselves all look great. It's the standard Hornby wheel, which is made of plastic with the metal tyre. Absolutely fine. And the cylinder / piston area with the crosshead is all very nicely cast. And like I say, the coupling and connecting rods are nice and fine. Yeah, the bottom half, or the chassis of the loco, is pretty good looking. So there you have it. It is a basic loco. The complexity in the detailing has definitely been cut back. I personally don't think to a terrible degree. If Hornby brought this out for 200 quid today, then obviously I would have an awful lot to say about that. But if this came back for 100, 120 quid, I would say yes, it's a basic model, but that is reflected in the price. And I would be fine with that, I think. The plastic construction is more problematic. I think if the warping is going to be there, then there's no excuse for the plastic running plate and such. Obviously, this is not okay. Yeah, you don't expect to have big visible marks on the bodywork. That should have been rejected, put in the bin, melted back down, whatever. It shouldn't have gone out to the customer. But yeah, all things considered, I think we've seen a lot worse. It's not going to be topping my charts by any means, but it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. Anyway, let's get this down onto the track, let's see how it performs, and also let's talk about the mechanism. So there she is down onto the track, and yeah, I don't really like the model too much because of the way it's been put together, but I have to say, I think it's a fantastic looking locomotive from a prototypical perspective. Yeah, just a fascinating design. The size of this thing as a tank engine is absolutely unbelievable. So the loco's body is obviously very cheaply manufactured in terms of its construction, its detail and its finish, but very fortunately the mechanism is kind of the opposite. This is still a high quality mechanism from Hornby, and that's what we're going to talk about before I show you the performance. So first of all, loads of pickups on just the driving wheels. So this is a 282 wheel configuration, so you've got 8 pickups, 4 per rail, which is really good. The non-driven axles do not have pickups on them, and in fact they don't even have any springing to them. They are just literally dangling under gravity. Now, people have had issues with this, and I seem to remember that Hornby might have changed the design on this. I have to say I have not had issues with this, so maybe there was an issue and Hornby fixed it. Maybe I've just been lucky and I haven't experienced any issues with that. But yeah, despite these not being sprung, that doesn't cause a problem for me, but your mileage may vary. The base keeper plate is fitted to the loco via screws, as you might expect, and loosening off those screws enables you to fully remove the base keeper plate for cleaning and servicing purposes. That's a great feature. The loco driving axles all have proper bearings on them, which is great to see, and the wheel set is just driven by a single gear, so it's nice and simple, not too over-engineered, not too over-complicated. The body removal is exactly as the instructions showed, so a couple of screws, one towards the front, one towards the back, and that reveals this die-cast chassis. Now, it is a metal die-cast chassis, like I say, but it's fairly unsubstantial. It doesn't fill out the body as I think it ought to in order to bring the loco's already poor weight up. The coal bunker, for instance, is completely hollow, and so is the boiler. Now, the DCC socket is right here next to the boiler, and I suppose the intention is that you put the decoder in the boiler. But I don't understand why they didn't put the decoder socket in the coal bunker and use that space for the decoder, and then that boiler could have been packed with weight, which would have gone right over the driving wheels, and the loco's weight could have been massively improved. As it is, it's a little bit of a cheap solution. We have got a 5-pole motor here though, which is pretty good. Not too keen on the design of this because the worm drive is fitted to the brush end of the motor, so any oil that comes off that worm drive and works its way along the shaft to the commutator can cause problems with these motors, and I've known that happen a few times. But it is 5-pole, so that's okay, and there is a very large flywheel here. I really like the radius of this flywheel because that will really build up some inertia, which is great. Obviously, bare bones chassis in that there are no speakers or lights fitted to this, so again, very, very simple from that point of view. The gauging back to back is quite interesting, 14.1 to 14.3 millimeters, so not too consistent, but quite consistently below the standard. So maybe that's intentional, given the size of the wheel set, to make sure that the loco can handle the tighter curves. But yeah, all in all, nothing absolutely remarkable about this mechanism, but it certainly ticks most of the boxes in terms of quality. So yeah, thumbs up on mechanism. I do think this one's pretty good. Anyway, how is the performance? I've had this thing warming up a little bit because I haven't run it for a while. So now I can show you the performance. And I have to say the gearing is pretty smart. I don't know whether that's just because the motor runs slow naturally or whatever, but no, I do think this has been deliberately geared to run slow. So let me show you this. Run it at 50% speed past the camera. Yeah, that's very sensible, isn't it? A lot of locos can run a lot faster than that at 50% speed, and I would say this one's quite sensible. Now, of course, they haven't taken any agency away from you. If you want to hit it with full speed, you can do that, but I would say the range of speed possible with this loco is quite prototypical, which is good. So, it's geared well. It's geared to run fairly slow. What does that mean for the crawl? Well, if I remember correctly, not too much. The crawl's not the greatest, but let's try. I'm easing it up very gradually. See if we can find the point at which this starts to move. Still doing it. Oh, I saw a twitch. And yeah, as you can see, it is good and slow, I suppose, but I think that's the least smooth crawl I've ever seen. It just jerks forward, very coggly. Yeah, you wouldn't want to do this, would you? Because it's just not realistic. How is it in reverse? Is the same true? Let's try again. Sometimes you get a smoother performance in one direction over the other, but not so much with this one. No, it's still coggy. And let's keep turning it up then. I'll start turning it up now. And there it's become a bit smoother. So it's not terrible by any means, but I think we have seen better. And I think with freight locos, the crawl is a bit more important than with passenger because there's a bit more shunting about, there's a lot more slow and careful work involved. So the fact that this one's not quite so good is a bit disappointing. That, coupled with the fact that the coupling on the back droops down massively, yeah, makes shunting a bit of a headache for this loco, but does it? Well, let's find out. I've set up this big rake of wagons. There's 20 probably, yeah, about 20 I would say there. Obviously this loco is not a powerhouse because of its lightweight. It weighs in obviously 236 grams like I say, and the tractive effort is only 0.35 newtons. So a lot less than a lot of the locos you'd be used to, and a lot less than many tank engines I've got, most of them even smaller than this in fact. But anyway, let's test the coupling. I don't have high hopes, but we might just be able to bodge our way through it. Let's see. Right, I'll try and do this as smoothly as possible. Let's slow down. Right, I can't actually see the coupling from where I am, so let's just pull forwards and see. Yeah, no big surprise there, not coupled properly. Yeah, coupling's drooping. I did try to change the coupling. I popped the whole pocket out and tried to put a different one in, but the other one I had did not fit. It was sort of too big to go in. Possible question mark over the compatibility of couplings. Yeah, this one, the one that came with it, the hook kind of almost there went underneath the coupling. I pushed this in. I almost had it a second ago. No, it's gone under it again. Come on, flipping heck. There we go, we've got it. So, even like this, it's only the loco coupling hook that's engaged. The wagon coupling hook is sort of floating above the loco's coupling bar. So it's not brilliant, is it, that? But it does seem to be coupled reliably. So let's see if it can haul it. Let's start off nice and gently. See if we can accelerate the train. Here we go. Yeah, a bit of a jerky start, but I have to say after that, beautifully smooth. And I can put a bit more power into the loco on this occasion without it going too fast, which is great. That's the power of good gearing for you. Okay, so let me show you what else I'm going to be running. On the middle line I have, I believe it's the 52XX, which is a very similar loco. It's just a 280 though, and it doesn't have the extended coal bunker. So this is kind of what the 72 would have looked like before its alterations or rebuilding. So there you go, still a freight loco, but I've hooked it up to some passenger coaches just for a bit of variety there. And then on the inside line, we have a superior loco to both of these. This is the Hornby 2800 class, which was produced around the same time. We're sort of talking early 2010s, but this I wouldn't say is a design clever locomotive. It's got much more detail, a better cab, slightly nicer finish, sprung buffers, more separately fitted details as opposed to just moulded ones, and it's a much nicer model in my opinion. Price-wise, not that much different from what I remember. Yeah, about 150, something like that. Again, things have changed. Inflation means that those prices wouldn't hold up today, but you see the point. Not a huge amount of difference there. So, here she goes with a bit of a freight train. Let's see how this goes. Coming up to the curves here. Ooh, bit of a slowdown there. Although, no, it's recovered quite nicely. So, I think really when you take a step back, when the loco's up and running, it's got a bit of a freight train and it's on the layout, and you're a bit too far away to notice the warped running plate and the glue marks and the moulded details as opposed to the separately fitted ones, I think the loco itself starts to shine through. It's obviously a very imposing loco, almost quite an attractive one as well with its shape and proportions and such, and given that it runs quite nicely at the medium speeds, you can really appreciate what a cool looking loco this is. And that's what makes me think that the design clever stuff could have actually worked, because looking at the loco like this, there's nothing obviously cheap about it. And if only they'd priced these a bit more reasonably, if they'd got that balance a bit better between cost and features, then I reckon this design clever stuff could have been a real success. As it was, I personally think they just charged too much for this stuff. And for me, when I received this model for the first time, I thought, wow, I was expecting a bit better than this. This is really quite basic. I don't think they were very open about the design clever stuff. I think it wasn't like a complete secret. I think they probably did justify it at some point, but it's not like the listings said, you know, this is a downgraded model, this is a simple model. They weren't putting it on the boxes, and like I say, the prices definitely weren't reflecting that. So it wasn't clear that that's what was being purchased when you would pick these things up. But overall, not an impressive loco on the whole. When you start looking up close, it's quite disappointing even. But from a distance, when it's up on the layout and running, it is an imposing machine, and dare I say it, even quite an impressive one. Let's have some ratings then for the Hornby 72XX. And as you can see, the loco has fared decently well, although there's nothing remarkable about this. The level of detail, for instance, I've given 3-star. Not a lot to shout about here. I think the moulded detail is really quite good. The rivets and body detailing all looks good and crisp, nothing wrong with that. But the finish is quite plasticky, yeah, very plasticky finish on this. No etched number plates, no sprung buffers. A lot of the detailing is just moulded rather than separately fitted. It's missing the screw-link couplings for its buffer beams, and the cab detail is quite basic, although I do like that there is some cab detail painted. So yeah, it's a 3-star for me. The performance is 4-star. Generally, it's a nice smooth performer. Not dreadfully powerful, of course, and down at the low speeds it is quite rough and coggy, but once it gets up to speed it is good and smooth. The droopy coupling on my example, don't know how common that is, does mean that coupling is a bit of a nightmare for this as well, so bear that in mind. Pulling power, not fantastic, 0.35 newtons or 22 coaches on straight and level track. Obviously, I've got pannier tanks that are more powerful than that. The loco is too light really, and the freight train that I've got it hauling today, it's not too far from the limits of this loco. The mechanism though, I've given 4.5. Yeah, at least the mechanism hasn't been cheaped out on too badly. So you've got lots of pickups on the driving wheels, proper bearings, nice and serviceable, easy to get into it, 5-pole motor, flywheel, etc, etc. I think they could have improved the chassis in terms of weight distribution. A little bit more weight in the boiler there would have made the loco much more powerful, and obviously it doesn't have any speakers or lighting or anything, although those would be a bonus. Obviously they're not necessarily requirements. The quality then, I've given a 2.5. The build quality generally isn't too bad. There's not too much visible messy glue, although there is that big splodge underneath the cab, and the factory worker obviously tried to polish it out, not too successfully. Very plasticky loco, both in its bodywork and its detailing. Those whistles, for instance, very plasticky looking. Slightly warped running plate as well, and of course generally quite lightweight, even down to the chassis. Not a very heavy loco. Value for money then, I guess I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt. I have no doubt that if this model was to come back today that it would be more expensive, because Hornby don't really pull the prices down of their older tooled locos, even though the tooling costs should have been long covered. No, they do keep putting the prices up of their locos, but that hasn't happened. Hornby haven't brought this back recently, so the latest RRP I could find was that one from my notes of 5 or 6 years ago, £150. I paid £85 for this when it was heavily discounted, so in today's money, that kind of price will actually be fairly reasonable for this. I think some of the loco shortcomings would be represented in that price now. Back in 2017, obviously that was a lot more money due to inflation, so take this with a pinch of salt, but I have to rate the loco based on the amount of money I have. I don't normally take inflation into account, so I'm not going to do that today. That would be a 4-star, although again, benefit of the doubt there. Overall then, that is 6.51 out of 10. Yeah, fairly mediocre, middle of the road score, grade a V actually. Obviously not as good as a lot of the stuff we have today. Let's pop this into the logbook then, where it is 15th place above the Haulage Class 45 and below the Hornby Tiger. Yeah, not a great loco this one. Okay for the right amount of money, but generally it was a little bit too expensive. Well folks, that will just about do it for this review. It's not a great loco, but I have enjoyed revisiting it. I mean, great or not, It's an interesting prototype, and the model does a good job of capturing that prototype in terms of its proportions and unusual looks, and obviously massive size and length. So from that point of view, it's an interesting model, and it's not one that I completely regret buying because there's nothing else quite like it. So from that point of view, yes, I like this model. Do I want to see Hornby bring this back? Not really, not unless they could do it at a really reasonable price. That would be possible, I think, because the tooling costs should have been covered quite a long time ago. So sure, if Hornby brought this back as a budget offering, then I would have no problem at all with seeing this come back. Do I think that's what they would do? Well, based on previous activity from Hornby, I would say probably not. I would expect this to come back costing £200 RRP. But I'd love to be proved wrong, so Hornby, if you're watching, you're thinking of bringing a budget loco back so that people can find a loco they can afford, I think that could be achieved with this one because it is quite basic. But anyway, that's just wishful thinking. I've seen nothing to suggest that's going to happen. But yeah, let me know down in the comments, what do you think about this? Have you owned one of these? What do you think if so? Would you buy one if Hornby brought this back? What price would be reasonable in your opinion? Let me know all of this down in the comments, but for now I'll say thank you again for watching, and I will see you very soon. Alright, cheers folks, you take care.